Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. For our guests in-house, we always appreciate the courtesy of checking that cell phones have been silenced as we prepare to begin. And, of course, for our Internet viewers, questions or comments can be directed to us at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. And we will, of course, post the program following today's presentation for your future reference on the Heritage website. Hosting our discussion and interviewing our special guest today is Dr. Lee Edwards. Dr. Edwards serves Heritage as our Distinguished Fellow in Conservative Thought. He is one of the leading historians on the American conservative movement. He has written more than 20 books, including William F. Buckley, The Maker of a Movement, The Conservative Revolution, The Essential Ronald Reagan, and Goldwater, The Man Who Made a Revolution. He is also the chairman of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation and an adjunct professor of politics at Catholic University. He previously served as the founding director of the Institute on Political Journalism at Georgetown. He has been a fellow at the Harvard University's Institute of Politics and a media fellow at the Hoover Institution, as well as a past president of the Philadelphia Society. And we're assuming today, Craig, that you are ready for your orals, since I understand he is going to give you all the questions, but none of the answers. Dr. Edwards?
Thank you, John. And I always like to recognize the fact that John Hibble, without him, so much of what we do here just wouldn't be possible, with he and his staff bringing the best speakers that we possibly get from around the country. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a beautiful day in Washington, D.C., and a great day to be alive, especially if you're a conservative and are here to listen to Craig Shirley talk about a great American. There are about 1,000 books about Ronald Reagan, and two of the best have been written by Craig Shirley. Reagan's Revolution, about his almost capture of the presidential nomination back in 1976, and Rendezvous with Destiny, which was all about Reagan's landslide presidential victory in 1980, and how that victory changed the nation and the world. Craig is noted for his meticulous research, his fast-paced narrative, and apt anecdotes. And I'm pleased to report that Craig has done it again in his latest book about our 40th president, Last Act, The Final Years and Emerging Legacy of Ronald Reagan. It's not easy to write about death, especially the death of someone whom you admire, to describe his legacy without being hagiographic, and to sum up his life fairly and honestly. And Craig, I'm pleased to report and happy to report and not surprised to report, has accomplished all of this in Last Act, a remarkable book about a remarkable man and president. Now, Craig's balanced study stands in marked contrast with a crude, revisionist look at President Reagan by Bill O'Reilly, best known for his bloviating commentaries on Fox News. O'Reilly tries, but fails miserably, to kill Reagan in his book. And he's so proud of his sources. Talks about, I double source all of my statements and all of my findings. Well, who are his sources? They turn out to be Kitty Kelly, the gossip queen of Hollywood, and Ron Reagan Jr., whose politics are far, far, far to the left of his father. The true measure of a great president, Craig writes, is whether the problems he was elected to solve still existed at the end of his term of office. And when Reagan was elected, let's remember, inflation was out of control. Interest rates were out of control. The economy was spiraling down, and the national mood was described as a malaise, and the West was losing the Cold War to the East. Quote, and yet, When he left office, inflation had all been eliminated. Interest rates were low, the economy was booming, unemployment was at 5.4%. The national mood was confident again, and the Soviet Union was in the final stages of losing the Cold War. Reagan's indisputable accomplishments have led the American public to consistently rank him among our greatest presidents. And perhaps one day, liberal historians will catch up with we the people. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving our guest author, Craig Shirley, a warm heritage welcome. Well, there's so many questions, and what we want to do is get right to the Q&A. But let me take the prerogative of asking the first. So why did you write this book? You've written these wonderful books about Ronald Reagan. Was there really a need to write Last Act?
Yeah, I think so, Lee. There have been books done about many presidents in retirement and in death. There was Nixon and Winter, Monica Crowley wrote, and of course Manhunt about yeah, right, which is about not only the death of Abraham Lincoln, but the search for John Wilkes Booth. And When the Cheering Ended was a book about Woodrow Wilson's last years. Jim Bishop, who was a terrific and I think underappreciated historian and investigative reporter, wrote FDR's last year. So a lot of scholarship has been devoted to post-presidency because in many ways it's about the legacy. And nothing had been ever written. As a matter of fact, you know, my books tend to be kind of family affairs. And Zareen, who's here today, you know, is my best editor and best critic. And, you know, the boys have done fact-checking. And about 5 years ago, our then, I think, 9-year-old son, Mitchell, was in the kitchen one night. I had hundreds of binders, newspapers, and material from the Reagan Library and all sorts of things. And his job was to go through and highlight every time Reagan's name was mentioned. And so he, you know, one night he just looks up and says to nobody, he says to me, but he says kind of aloud, he says, "Dad, has anybody ever done a book about Reagan after he was president?" And I thought for a second, I said, "No, nobody has." So that was really the birth of Last Act.
Well, it's an extraordinary piece of research, and always
Thank you.
One of the first things I always do when I get a book like this is look at the back of the book. What about the endnotes? What about the footnotes? What about the sources? And you are a prodigious researcher. It's amazing. It really is.
Thank you.
It's amazing. Well, I've asked the first question, but please, we're going to jump right into the Q&A. What's on your mind? What are some of the questions you would like to ask? Yes, sir. Are we going to? Yeah.
Can you say how Reagan's attitude, his personal attitude on his own religious persuasion changed in the end, or was there any change in his beliefs and his faith?
He was always devout. You know, some people mistakenly say, well, because he didn't go to church, he wasn't devout. As a matter of fact, he was very devout. After the assassination attempt, he was meeting with Father Hesburgh, and after he recovered from the gunshot wound, and Hesburgh said, you know, God's hand was on your shoulder that day. And Reagan replied, yes, and whatever time I have left is his. He was very, very, but he didn't make a big scene about his faith. Like he was born again, but he didn't make a big scene about it like Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter, I think, in many ways, politicized his religion and his born again, his foot washing Baptist approach to life, and you know, no drinking in the White House and no dancing in the White House and all things like that. Reagan didn't really politicize it. It was much more private for him. So his faith was already pretty deep even before the Alzheimer's. I don't know. I think there was, in the farewell letter, there were, you know, he made the reference obviously to, you know, going in the sunset of life and going home. And I think the phrase going home has a great deal, you know, of meaning to a lot of Christians, as we've seen over time. So I think his faith was always there. I don't know if it drove it deeper into him. It certainly did after the assassination attempt.
Yes, please. Yeah.
I'm not sure that I'm asking the right person on this, but you know so much about Reagan, and I'm just interested in this wonderful economic recovery that he had after the 1980. And there were, conservatives tend to attribute this to the tax cuts.
Right.
And I don't think there's any question that tax cuts help stimulate economies and so forth. But there was another thing that was going on. It was a demographic advantage, and that the baby boomers were finally hitting their earning years, and that was a big generation. They were young, and they were really getting into the labor force. There were more women at that point getting into the labor force, and that helps the GDP as well. And this was the beginning of the debt super cycle, where if you look at the graphs, more consumers were going more heavily into debt, more corporations, and the government was going more heavily into debt. And all these factors seems to me to merge together to explain that wonderful economic recovery. And I'm concerned about it because conservatives today are still talking about, let's go back to the Reagan tax cuts and it's going to solve all our problems. Well, we're on the other end of the demographic revolution. All the women that are going to be working are working, et cetera, et cetera. So you don't have all those variables that we had then. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that, and whether we can repeat the Reagan miracle, economic miracle.
Well, don't forget, too, is that the conditions which you describe existed when Jimmy Carter was president, except we went into recession. They existed when George H.W. Bush became president, and yet we went into a recession. All the conditions as far as demographics and women entering the workforce and everything else, they existed at the beginning, from 79 to 80, and they existed from 88 to 92, and yet both presidents experienced recession. Reagan didn't. So I think there was something more to the Reagan presidency than just luck, as maybe you're suggesting, is that I think, is that, he said early in his administration, he said he was giving a talk to a group of conservatives here in Washington, and he said, the tax cuts, yeah, they're about the economy and this and that, the other thing, but he said they're really about reordering man's relationship to the state. Now, that's a very profound thought. B, is what politician talks like that anymore? Nobody talks like that, except maybe Gingrich, who understand. But he understood, Reagan understood that power can neither be destroyed nor created, it can only be moved around. So the power was either going to be in Washington, where the liberals, and since the time of the New Deal, wanted it, or it was going to be in the hands of the American people, where the framers and founders wanted to be since the time of 1776 and 1787. He wanted to move power away from Washington back to the individual, and if the economy grew, then that was great. But I think also is that, he said in his farewell address is that one of his three great accomplishments was restoring the morale of the American people. And you cannot, he understood that America operated on a higher moral plane than any other country in history. But in order to raise armies and to pay for military hardware and to pay for SDI and to run the Soviets into the ground, you need a thriving economy. But in order to have a thriving economy, you have to raise the American morale and American spirituality. So the American morale, the economy was raised in many ways because Reagan was talking about the American economy. Reagan was talking about the productivity of the American people. Reagan was talking about the future, something that people thought, as of 1979 with Carter's malaise, is that they didn't have a future. Reagan becomes president, and they realize, yes, we do, and I have a future for my children too. So they become more infused with certitude about the future and about their own economic situation, and so that they become more productive, become happier people. So it's a long answer, but I think that Reagan is singularly unique in that Carter was president for 4 years, and yet we lost jobs and the economy failed. George Bush was president for 4 years. We lost the economy, lost jobs, and went into a recession. Reagan's president for 8 years, and we create 18 million jobs, and he turns around the morale of the American people. Is that it wasn't just all happenstance. Something really proactive happened.
I might add also that one of the group of people who were inspired by Ronald Reagan were the entrepreneurs out in California, that so many of Steve Jobs got started just about that time.
Right.
And the whole Silicon Valley phenomenon really began in the 1980s as a result of Reagan's optimism and encouragement and looking to the entrepreneurial class to make a difference, which it did.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And just to further that point is that the Department of Labor then and still today does not count entrepreneurs when they do their monthly unemployment statistics. They just, kind of arbitrarily draw the numbers from big corporations, but they don't count entrepreneurship in America, and that's been the fastest growing part of the American economy for a generation.
Right. Please.
You mentioned the Alzheimer's, and it seems to me that the big battle, which you've started here, but I don't think it'll be finished, will be over when the progress of Reagan's Alzheimer's, and whether it was evident and even determinative in the last couple of years of the presidency. You have the evidence of his diaries, which suggest that he was sharp. You have the incredible speech to the convention in '88, where there's at some point there's like a pop of something in the audience, and he very quickly says, "Missed me." I mean, if he was out of it, we wouldn't be able to make comments like that, and the farewell address. But then you have in '89 and '90 the testimony at the legal cases, where he says, "I simply can't remember things while he was president." What, in your opinion, is the chart as far as when things really began to go down in the crucial years between '89 and '94 when he writes the letter?
Yeah, Gary, I can only go off the historical record, and is that from the library and from other sources. He went to Mayo. He and Mrs. Reagan went to Mayo every year for physical, psychological testing. Number sequences and colors and this and that. And he passed every year with flying colors. The first year they showed more than age-appropriate loss of memory, cognitive skills, was 1994, which was 6 years after leaving the White House. But I think you're right, is that if you look at the letters, you look at the diary entries, you look at the testimony of hundreds of staffers, everybody from Ed Meese to Dick Allen to everybody in between says is that he was just as bright and engaging and hands-on as when he left in January '89 as when he entered in January of '81. So it's a good question. It's a worthy question. By the way, too, is that there was a medical doctor whose name escapes me, who wrote an article for the New York Times the week of the Reagan funeral, in which he totally recanted charges he'd made earlier, several years earlier, that Reagan was out of it. And as a matter of fact, he said Reagan was sharp, Reagan was on top of it, Reagan knew staff aides, knew everything. This was completely missed by, a lot of things were missed by O'Reilly, including the truth. But this was completely missed by O'Reilly, and I think the debate is over. Really, it's too bad that we've got to go back and relitigate this, because the debate is over. Is that Reagan never would have done these things, never would have accomplished these things had he been addle-brained or watching soap operas all day or anything else like that.
Let me just add. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. To which I would say, fine. But what about him saying goodbye, totally a shocker to everyone watching at the '92 convention?
How do you mean?
When he said the very last words of his speech in '92, so it's 2 years
Houston,
before, where he says good.
Well, but I think he was just being wistful. I was there on the floor that night, and I think he was just. I mean, he knew how old he was. He knew that the likelihood that he was going to speak 4 years later might be problematic. I think, but he was also romantic. He saw everything as a romantic, and so it made perfect sense that he would say, goodbye. He even talked about, at the end of '88, riding off into the sunset, saddling up or riding off into the sunset. The man was a born romantic, so the idea, I mean, he saw the world in terms of good and evil, and what is better evidence you need of being romantic, the Enlightenment type of attitude about things, is that he saw the Soviet Union as evil and we were good. There was no moral ambiguity there. So the idea that he said goodbye, I don't think he was indicating that he had Alzheimer's. That was just Reagan being Reagan.
It seems to me, I'll just add a couple of things if I may, that the important thing is whether or not there was evidence of Alzheimer's while he was president, And what I like to do is to quote Edmund Morris, who had access without any restrictions to Reagan from, I guess it was 85 through the end of his presidency, and then beyond that, and then wrote, work, and came up with a rather peculiar book in which he had imaginary characters and dialogue and so forth. But at the same time, he did say at that point, when he came out with that book, that biography, that he had read every page of the Reagan diaries, which he had kept while president. And that he was the first person to have access to those. And he said, I have read all of them, and there is no diminution of mental acuity, or some such phrase as that, on the part of Reagan, that it's just as sharp in the beginning as it is at the end of his presidency. So no sign. By Edmund Morris, who was not an unapologetic admirer of Reagan. He had real skepticism about him and had difficulty understanding him, but he could look at the record and make that judgment. The other thing I think we have to keep in mind, and which I like to mention, is Reagan at Reykjavik. And there was one point there, I believe, where he and Mikhail Gorbachev were one-on-one with their interpreters for, what was it, at least half a day, may have been 8 hours, 10 hours, some extraordinary period of time. The two of them going back and forth, talking about what they might do in terms of the IMF and the intermediate missiles and so forth. How could anybody with Alzheimer's do a one-on-one like that for, let's say, 8 or 10 straight hours? Not possible. And that was in '87. So to me, yes, you can talk about the later, perhaps, signs of it, but while he was president, when it was the most important time to have ability to understand what was going on and to make sound judgments and to make sound decisions, there's no sign of Alzheimer's.
Hi. I'm going to start with an observation that I believe is true and then jump 3 very quick questions that kind of come out of that. No matter where you were on the political spectrum, left, right, there seemed to be a feeling from a lot of people, and I think correctly so, that Reagan was a very genuine person, which I find kind of ironic since he was an actor and could fit into anything. But I mean, that comes across. So I wondered, Craig, if you would talk a little bit about those characteristics of him that led the American people beyond, which we seem to be lacking today. That would be question 1. Number 2, a lot of people today, want to be Reagan heirs, but I think they miss something about the man inside. You've kind of hinted on that. What advice would you give to someone who said, I'd like to be in Reagan's footsteps? What should they do? And the last one is the toughest one, I think. Is there anybody out there who is the heir apparent to Ronald Reagan? Of the 6'15" left Republicans, and we'll throw in the 5 Democrats and whoever else is running. So any of those are all.
I can't remember all 4. My answer on 2016 in the Republican field is that none of them are son of Reagan and all of them are son of Reagan. All of them in some way, shape, or form. Nobody's running for president calling themselves a Nixon Republican, right? And there's only one guy who's calling himself a Bush Republican. They all, to some extent, to some extent, is that they infuse or adopt or channel or whatever Ronald Reagan. Anybody who's a Republican calls themselves a Reagan Republican, not just because it's alliterative, because it means something. Is that I think Reaganism is, in a way, and maybe Lee, you agree or disagree with me, I think Reaganism is, in a way, its own distinct strain of American conservatism. And he brought it to the forefront starting in the 60s, and then refined it as he went on. So by 1980, it's clear that it is very much, it's almost a synthesis in a way of Solzhenitsyn and Thomas Paine, his two favorite philosophers. And you say, well, how can that be? Is that Paine is the very child of the Enlightenment, and Solzhenitsyn eviscerates the Enlightenment. I think that he found synthesis, and maybe Immanuel Kant wrote, you know, the early father of the Enlightenment, talked about rational man, and that God-inspired man. And I think that Reagan is that rejected Tom Paine's contention, or the Enlightenment contention, that man belonged at the center of the universe without God, but also rejected Solzhenitsyn's position that God belonged at the center of the universe without man. Is that his synthesis was that if God was at the center of the universe, then it was because God wanted him there, and moreover, if he is God-inspired, then God is there with him. So I think that's how he was able to, he used a phrase in 1980, he said man with God. He didn't say man and God, he said man with God, and I think he really believed that. So is that inherently you are an optimist. If you believe that, you are an optimist, which means you believe in the individual, which takes you back to the revolution, and that back to my point earlier about power can either be assigned here or there, but it can't be assigned both places. But is that so that he believed very much in the power of the individual. He talked about it often. So that's, I think, in some ways, his refined conservatism, Reaganism, as its own ideology. It's very much about the individual. It's very much about the future. Two things that Republicans in the 60s and 70s weren't talking about. You know, they're all green eye shade, you know, balanced budget types. They weren't talking in spiritual tones or in hopeful tones. You know, so that, I guess, is the answers, what Reagan was about. I'm trying to answer what Reagan was about. As far as the candidates today is that what my advice would be is don't accept the status quo. Don't accept you know, Reagan was a revolutionary. He always challenged the status quo. And the best example is the Soviet Union. I mean, the centerpiece of his foreign policy is that containment, détente, whatever you wanted, had been the policy of the United States, bipartisan, by both parties from 1945 up until 1980. Reagan discards it. Is that to the neocons and to the high Tories is that the Soviet Union was a thing of permanence. The Berlin Wall was a thing of permanence. So we would always have a Cold War. We would always have the Soviet Union as an adversary. Reagan is the first one, really, who comes along and says, you know, obviously Gene Kirkpatrick and others, but he's the first political leader to really come along and say, no, we can defeat the Soviet Empire. We can defeat the Soviet Union. We can, you know, is that the individual can win out over the state, which is radical thinking, which makes him, of course, a danger to the establishment, because the establishment is invested in the status quo, right? So he was always challenging. He was always, don't ever let anybody tell you that Ronald Reagan was a reactionary. He wasn't. He was a revolutionary. Whether it's on tax cuts or on life or on issue of the Soviet Union, obviously, on issue after issue after issue, he was always challenging conventional wisdom. And so my advice to the candidates would be, don't accept any premise that's thrown at you by Fox News or by CNN or by a reporter or by other candidates or whatever else. There's always a better way forward than the status quo. And the other thing too is be very anti-establishment, is to be against the elites, because the elites are wrong all the time anyway. So I don't know if I answered your question. Okay, all right. Okay.
Well, I think that you touched, I can't resist it, you just touched upon the essential Ronald Reagan with that, and that was that he was a thinking conservative.
Yes.
That a philosophy undergirded him. And as he said, I'm not a great communicator, Reagan said, but I communicated great things. And those great things included first principles, included freedom, which included victory in the Cold War, included the entrepreneurial spirit and trying to engender it. In 1965, and some of you probably heard me say this before, I had a chance to visit with Reagan, this before he ran for governor. And we were in his home, Ann and I, my wife and I, and we're in this library, and there facing me were several hundred books in his library. So I immediately went over and began looking at the titles. And what were the titles? They were histories, they were biographies, they were economics. There was The Road to Serfdom by Hayek. There was Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt. There was Witness by Whittaker Chambers. You know, Reagan was not some kind of, you know, actor on strings, that somebody was pulling the strings. He was a thinking conservative. And that's why, if anybody wants to say, I want to be like Reagan, well, you better have started 20 or 30 years ago and not just try to do it in the last 6 months. Yes, sir.
Hi. Is there much of a record on Reagan's feelings on his successor, the President Bush, the first? Because I'm not really aware of it, but maybe there is.
I actually dealt with that in Last Act. He was, you're talking about Bush. Correct. He was utterly and completely loyal to Bush. Is that they started out not liking each other very much. Is that, I don't know if you remember, but Bush challenged Reagan for the 1980 nomination. And at the time is that the big issue, the only issue was Reagan's age, and is he too old to seek the presidency, and he's too decrepit, blah, blah, blah. So Bush's centerpiece of his campaign was his jogging. He was constantly jogging all the time. Gee, I mean, he's jogging for the media. He's doing. Then he goes to the YMCA in Concord, New Hampshire, to do sit-ups and challenges Reagan to do sit-ups. At one point is that, you know, Reagan gets really frustrated. He says, you know, we elect presidents not to run foot races. We elect them to display judgment and maturity. And it was a good turnaround. But so they went on the ticket. It really was a team of rivals. They didn't have much. I mean, they didn't have anything together culturally. They had nothing together. I mean, Reagan went to Eureka College, and here was Bush was the scion of the Ivy Leagues. You know, the Mayflower Society, and the wives didn't get along at all. Is that, you know, Barbara, even though they both went to Smith, which is interesting, but they didn't get along. So there's nothing together. There's nothing in agreement ideologically. There's nothing there's nothing in agreement culturally. So, but Reagan is able to overcome this, so that by the time the fall campaign rolls around, he's giving Bush a lot more respect, because Bush is proving himself to be tougher than Reagan thought, and Reagan has proven himself to be more thoughtful than Bush thought. So that there was a solid, genuine friendship all the years of the presidency, and Reagan, you know, initiated the weekly lunches, just the two of them every Tuesday had lunch together. The only time Reagan ever missed it was when he was in the hospital, first shot and then with the cancer surgeries, but otherwise he always made those lunches. But you know, in '92, Reagan had gone to, Reagan's now 4 years into retirement, he went to New York City for, maybe you were there was a group of conservatives who were having lunch with him at the City Club. Meese was there, Larry Kudlow was there, others were there, and this was a time when Pat Buchanan was, you know, mounting a challenge to Bush. But Larry asked Reagan about it, and Reagan was sticking by Bush. That was it. There was no question about it. Even though he knew Pat, he was friendly with Pat. Pat had worked for him, but he was sticking by Bush. So, I mean, Reagan loyalty was a prized thing. So, what was it? You know, it was.
Curious if post Reagan's presidency, in '92, he would look at those Bush 4 years and didn't like what he saw.
He never said anything publicly. Yeah. And as a matter of fact, Bush was one of the few, to be invited to speak at the funeral. I mean, even though he was an ex-president, he was going to speak at the funeral. He and Nancy had made that decision years before. One person who didn't speak at the funeral, who wanted to speak at the funeral, made a real pain in the ass of himself, was Bill Clinton. It's just, you know, the whole week, you know, he was calling, he's got to be bipartisan. He kept all these people intercede, you know, having people call Mrs. Reagan and call Jim Baker and call Ed Meese and call others, said, you know, he's got to speak. And there was no way, shape, or form Nancy Reagan was going to allow Bill Clinton to speak at her husband's funeral. There was just no way.
Please, here.
Al Milliken, AM Media. Did you ever get the opportunity to meet his first wife, Jane Wyman? And do you know, did they ever have interaction in the last part of his life. And then, as far as his children go, were they all cooperative with you, or I mean, did you seek them out to do this book? And I just wanted to know what your perspective was on Ronald Jr. His
Prescott.
Okay,
Yeah.
his public atheism, that's now on TV. You have an explanation for that?
No, I don't have an explanation for it. Is that historically presidential families can be real pains in the neck. Payne, who was James Madison's stepson, was such an inveterate gambler, he lost so much money that Dolly Madison had to sell Montpelier to pay off his campaign debts. Lincoln had his problems with Robert. Johnson and Nixon had brothers who were associated with shady characters. Billy Carter was a bad news buffet all by himself. Eisenhower's son John was a philanderer. The Roosevelt children said they never knew their own father and their own mother. They were too busy pursuing their own careers. So is that the Reagan children's problem was probably kind of tamed by comparison in some ways. Is that Teddy Roosevelt's children were all good children, but they were also, hellraisers. And of course, Alice Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt's daughter. Teddy Roosevelt, she was so wild. Somebody went to Teddy Roosevelt and says, "You got to get Alice under control. She's out of control." And Roosevelt says, "I can be president of the United States or I can control Alice. I cannot possibly do both." So the Reagan's children's problems was pretty tame by comparison. So as far as his atheism, look, I don't know. It's Jane Wyman. Jane Wyman was at the funeral, and Jane Wyman said a very tender note, is that she never, ever badmouthed Reagan publicly after the divorce. He never badmouthed her. Mike floated between two different worlds, between the world of his mother, the world of his father, and maybe it was not to the great benefit of his child rearing, but they did the best they could. She voted for Ronald Reagan in 1980. She issued a statement saying, my children worked hard for that campaign, and I'm proud to cast my vote for him. So the marriage ended, it ended. But to both of theirs credit, they never badmouthed each other publicly. And as a matter of fact, I don't even think they badmouthed each other privately.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I think many people tried to get an interview with Jane Wyman.
Yeah.
They really wanted her to, what's the real inside dope on Ronnie? And she always refused, never gave such an interview.
She ended up an extremely devout Catholic, by the way, in Palm Desert. Yeah.
As a matter of fact, just one other point on that is that when Maureen died, she and Nancy sat together at the funeral and held hands. So.
Yeah, right there.
Craig, can you talk about the impact that the final years had on the Reagan legacy overall? It seems to me that there was a change in the way the American people saw Ronald Reagan because of the grace with which he handled his final years. And he went, in my mind, he went from being admired to being beloved by the
Yes.
American people. Do you agree with that, and can you talk
Yes.
about that?
Yeah, an interesting observation came from, and I have it here in the book, from David Gergen, and I think he was correct. He says, people loved Eisenhower even before he was elected, but because he was a war hero. And other presidents, they actually had romantic feelings about before they were elected. George Washington, obviously, is that Reagan was elected, but they didn't have romantic feelings about him until the assassination attempt, and then they saw the grace under pressure with which he handled the assassination attempt. And I think that his point was that it only deepened after the Alzheimer's and the grace and style with which he and Nancy handled that as well. So I don't think there's any doubt whatsoever is that people, if Reagan had been a failed president, it would not have been as romantic or as loving, I guess is the right word, as it was. So but he had both. He was a successful president, and he handled both the shooting and the Alzheimer's with dignity and quiet style. So I think that only deepened the American people's affection for him. I do worry, though, you know, and maybe Lee can talk about this too, is that we miss some of the historical aspects of Reagan because we're so caught up in the romanticism of Reagan.
Yeah, I think it's important to balance that off and to look at the very real accomplishments, whether you're talking, we've already talked about the economic prosperity which came out of his policies, talked about restoring the Americans' faith in themselves and confidence in themselves and the future of the country, and then, of course, what he did in the foreign policy field. Margaret Thatcher's marvelous phrase in which she said that Ronald Reagan won the Cold War without firing a shot. And it's true that through his policy of peace through strength. So there's a great deal there, and I'm sure that historians will get into that. But I know, Craig, in your wonderful book, that you talk about how the American public's admiration and ranking and approval of him just keeps going up and up, it seems.
Yeah, it is interesting. Well, he was always, you know, is that the American people, you know, historians poo-poo the American people, but actually their opinion counts more than the historians. They're the ones who vote. And so Reagan was always in high estimation, especially in the last several years among the American people. So was John Kennedy. Was he a great president? No, but I think he had the potential to be a great president. But I don't think there's any doubt whatsoever that Reagan, but if you don't believe me, I would refer you to two liberal historians, James McGregor Burns, who is the great historian of FDR, said he would rank Reagan in the great or near great category. And then John Patrick Diggins, who is in many ways Lee's counterpart, because as much as Lee has been the historian of the American right of the 20th century, he was the historian of the American left in the 20th century. He wrote books about the labor movement, and he wrote books about the women's movement. But his last book was called Ronald Reagan, Fate, Freedom, and the Making of History. And in this book, this liberal historian says Ronald Reagan was one of our four greatest presidents because, like Washington, Lincoln, and Franklin Roosevelt, he freed or saved many, many people.
Please.
I guess I'm somewhat a heretic. As an American, I actually felt freer and safer during the Cold War than I do now. We didn't have terrorist attacks and things like that during the Cold War. It was a very black and white world. And oppressive governments tend to restrict radical religious groups. Some of this was bubbling up during Reagan's time, obviously Iran. But do you have any idea how he could have responded to radical Islamism?
Yeah, because he did.
Well,
The Achille Lauro, you know, where he, you know, sent the Navy or Air Force jets to capture the terrorist who seized the Achille Lauro. There were a lot of terrorist attacks in the 1980s. People forget. Libya, yeah, right, exactly. Is that, so I don't think it was difference between, because we've had terrorist attacks. KAL 007 was a terrorist attack, you know, I mean, it might have been by the Soviets, but it's still terrorism. It was still state-sponsored terrorism. Is that, I think, so the difference is that we didn't have terrorist attacks. The difference is that we had a president who gave us a lot of comfort and a lot of belief that he was going to, he understood that the first job of the government of the United States and the President of the United States was to defend the peace and freedom of the American people. And he understood that. And I think that you contrast that with our present-day president, I don't think he understands that. He doesn't understand the first job of the President of the United States. So I think it's not that the circumstances of terrorism are different. I think the circumstances of who is in the Oval Office is different.
Yes, please.
Thank you first of all, thank you for coming. I just moved to Washington, D.C. from California. And I've been a member of Reagan Library back in California for the past 12, 14 years or so. My comment is Reagan's was against the communism. I'm talking about Soviet Union. It's well documented. However, I never hear anything of Reagan talking about Chairman Mao. I wonder, was there any episode on that, or?
Oh, that's
that you know
that's
of?
an interesting question. I'm sure that he wrote about, China was not perceived to be, yes, I know the John Birch Society and Vietnam and Asia and all those other things, but China, I don't think was perceived to be the threat that the Soviets were in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. The Soviets were far more expansionist-minded than China, despite their, aiding the North Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia and all that. But even having said that, is that the Soviets were much more expansive-minded as far as Central America, as far as obviously Cuba, which had fallen, and their active efforts to undermine Western governments in Western Europe in the 1960s and 70s. So I don't know. Is that Reagan? I'm sure spoke about it, but he had the Soviet Union on his mind more than he had Red China on his mind.
Well, it's an interesting question, and it so happens that back in the 1970s, I had an opportunity to interview Ronald Reagan a couple of times. And at one of those interviews, he talked about Korea in a very interesting way, in which he said that Harry Truman could have been a great president. And I think, I'm paraphrasing now, but he was not because of what happened in Korea. He said if he had done all that could have been done and should have been done to win that war, that would have affected what was happening in Asia for the rest of the next couple of decades, whether it was Vietnam even. He talked about that and the impact of that. And so coming out of that, I would extrapolate the thought that he felt that, yes, that Mao was one of the things that caused us to lose the battle, and that he would have taken appropriate action. Now, what that would have been, I don't know, but he certainly was conscious and aware of the importance of the Korean War and of Vietnam. As you know, he did say more than once that Vietnam was a noble cause and a noble war. So there again, he was very much aware that communism was a threat, not only in the so-called captive nations in Eastern and Central Europe, but also in Asia. Other questions?
Just one part in the book that I found so fascinating, which you haven't addressed here, was about St. Elizabeth's and Hinckley. And I just think that's a fascinating story in the book.
Is that and you know what? This goes to somebody else. Somebody asked about Reagan's Christian faith, and I should have thought of this at the time. And I beg your pardon. Is that after? Thank you for the question. After the assassination attempt, Reagan called Dr. Daniel Ruge who was the White House physician, and asked him to come to the Oval Office, and he did, of course. And Reagan expressed an interest in meeting with John Hinckley personally. Hinckley was already being incarcerated at St. Elizabeth's Hospital. And he asked him why, and naturally, and he said he wanted to forgive the young man. Not an official presidential pardon, but a personal pardon. And Ruge said, okay, well, I will call the head of St. E's and look into it. He called Roger Peel, Dr. Roger Peel, who was the head of psychiatric at St. Elizabeth's Hospital. And he asked him, he said, look, the president would like a private meeting with Hinckley to tell the young man that he forgave him for shooting him. And so Peel said, let me talk to the attending physicians, his psychiatrists, and I'll get back to you. Now, St. Elizabeth's was in the process of being transferred from the jurisdiction from D.C. government to the federal government, which meant is that a presidential pardon would have arguably rained down a lot of much needed federal dollars on which was struggling at the time. It's been struggling for years, ever since Lincoln's time. But so anyway, he talked to the 6 physicians, and they said it would not be advisable. Hinckley has no remorse whatsoever. He doesn't. They've never seen anybody more sociopathic than John Hinckley. He only feels his own pain. He doesn't understand. He doesn't comprehend anybody else's pain or suffering. And that if Reagan met with Hinckley, then in Hinckley's mind it would be seen as a vindication that it was a good thing, or it was okay or acceptable to have shot Reagan and the other 3 men. So they went back to Reagan. Dr. Ruge went back to, or Dr. Peel went back to Dr. Ruge, and then actually Reagan and Dr. Peel talked personally. And they explained why, and Reagan understood. Dr. Peel told me when I interviewed him, he said, you know, at the time it seemed like Reagan was talking from the clouds, and then he later found out Reagan had been placing the phone call from Air Force One. So
Yes, please.
I know it's a little too soon to be talking about your next book, but I'm curious if you have given any thought to writing one about Nancy.
I have. I've gone back and forth on that. I might still do it. This is my 3rd Reagan book. My 4th Reagan book comes out, I guess, next year. And that's called Becoming Reagan. And it's about that time between 1976 and 1980, where Lee wrote a very important book called The Conservative Movement. And it really is about that time, about Reagan and the conservative movement and the maturation. Heritage comes, into existence, and there's really a conservative movement is in full flower, conservative enlightenment from 1976 and 80, and Reagan's at the vanguard of it, but a lot of things are happening. So that is my 4th book. I'm also have finished a book called Citizen Newt, which is about the life and times, obviously, of Newt Gingrich. And I just got a contract from HarperCollins to write a book about Mary Ball Washington, George Washington's mother, about whom a book has never been written. And she's arguably the most important woman in the history of America. Without Mary Ball Washington, there's no George Washington. Without George Washington, there might not be an American Revolution. But in the course of my preliminary research, you'll be interested to know I found out she was half helicopter mom, half mommy dearest. So she was not a really terrific person. Is that when he was away, he's at Valley Forge, fighting the revolution, attending to all these dying, men, and he finds out that his mother has petitioned the Virginia legislature saying, my son has left me destitute, he's left me poor, I need a retainer from the Virginia state government, and of course it's all a lie, because she had 2 farms, she had plenty of food, she had plenty of money, she had plenty of slaves, she just made it up. So Washington literally had to leave didn't leave Valley Forge, but he had to communicate to the Virginia legislature, is that it's not true. My mother's being well taken care of. There's just endless stories like that about her. Interestingly enough, is that she was a Tory all during the time of the American Revolution. Is that her son is leading the American Revolution, and she's a Tory sympathizer. So anyway, I'm looking forward to getting into that book. So I have a list. I have a list on a Yale legal tablet of right now about 26 more books, and Nancy is on there. I don't know if I can last 26 more books. So.
You certainly can. You certainly can. Craig has undertaken a new career. Now, he used to be a marvelous public affairs and public relations consultant here in Washington, D.C.
As were you.
And we are so fortunate, we in the conservative movement, that he decided to sort of dip into writing books and becoming, and he has become truly, ladies and gentlemen, one of the preeminent conservative historians in America. We're looking forward to all those great books. But before they come, we have this one here, Last Act, and copies are available for purchase. The author will be happy to sign it until his arm falls off. And so please join me in thanking Craig for being with us this afternoon.
Thank you.